Good morning, everyone. I'm Ranji Khanna. I direct the Franklin Humanities Institute here, and I'm really pleased to see you all here. This is the 6th year of this program, tgiFHI, where we invite a faculty member to talk about their research or their practice, we try to do it about 6 times or so a semester, and we have 2 more this semester, 2 more this semester. No, I think 3 more. No, 2 more. 2 semester. Who knows? Okay. And I hope that you will just look on our events page and come along, and as with any of our events, we'd love to have you here and to be in conversation. I have asked Scott Lindroth this morning to introduce John Supko, and so I'm just going to invite him up to do that. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And
good morning, everybody. John Supko joined the Duke Music Faculty in 2009 after earning a PhD at Princeton University and then serving as a teaching fellow at Harvard. During the search, I remember how impressed we were by the scope of his imagination and the clarity with which he articulated his artistic agenda. And we were so excited to have him join us as a colleague at Duke. At the time, we sought to deepen our curriculum in music technology. And this seems like a straightforward and even a practical goal for a music department, but it turns out to be more complicated than you might think. And why is that? Electronic music and computer music often call into question the relevance of much traditional musical training. For example, virtuosity in an acoustic instrument, not necessarily required. Fluency with music notation might be, your notation might be entirely irrelevant in this case. And so and electronic music often occupies this indistinct space between sound, noise, and music, and calls into question even what is the nature of a musical idea in the first place, and how can it be treated in a composition. So these are some of the challenges. Well, what are the skills that are celebrated in electronic or computer music? I remember a quip by the great electronic music composer Mario Davidovsky when he said that he was a virtuoso with the razor blade because he spent all his time splicing tape into, to make his compositions. In computer music, in the early years of that, one almost had to become a software engineer. When I was first learning computer music, I had to learn the C programming language, and for a musician, something that was in C meant something very different than. And more to the point, though, the emphasis was overwhelmingly on sound design. And so composers had to come to grips with digital signal processing, a subject which is more typically found in an electrical engineering department. So for these and other reasons, computer music often had little overlap with the conventional music curriculum. It tended to be cordoned off into a separate corner of the department, sometimes a separate building on the campus. So there are those issues of how to assimilate electronic and computer music into a music department. On the plus side, electronic and computer music from its earliest days was far more inclusive than the music making or studies in the traditional musical institutions. Computer music, after all, was developed at Bell Labs in the 1950s. The first electronic music studios in Europe were established at radio stations, at government radio stations. So from the outset, artists working in popular music, theater, and radio, as well as composers interested in experimental genres, were able to gain access to these facilities to explore this new genre. So computer music and electronic music, thereby it has genuine connections to both popular and experimental art. The electronic music composer Morton Subotnick spoke of being visited in his New York City studio by members of the Grateful Dead and the Mothers of Invention in the 1960s. In the early aughts, the band Radiohead based one of its songs on a computer music composition by the composer Paul Lansky, who happened to be John Supko's dissertation advisor at Princeton. So these It turns out then that this offers, teaching computer music in a university offers a fascinating way to discuss two musical genres that at one time did not have much purchase in a music department. To his credit, John has steered clear of the problems associated with computer music while embracing the exciting artistic and pedagogical opportunities that it affords. His classes in computer music are among the most popular offerings in our music department, and this speaks as much to his effectiveness as his teacher and as an artist as it does to the inherent interest of students in the subject. And an important dimension of his artistry, of John's artistry, is that he's not as invested in the technical geekery of signal processing and sound design, but instead cultivates another path, one that was perhaps less intensively explored in the early days of computer music, but today has become its central focus. And this is the project of computer-assisted composition, generative music, or maybe algorithmic composition. Now, it might seem that thinking of music composition as the output of an algorithm is, the culmination of this post-war modernist project where intricate formal design and complexity come together. Though in truth, that integral serialism, as it was called, had run its course by the end of the 1950s. No, I think for John, the real driver of his interest in computer-assisted composition is something quite different. I think algorithms offer the possibility of discovering something entirely new in music, something strange, something weirdly alluring. John is seeking mystery rather than airtight coherence. What's more, this way of thinking, if we can generalize that to all other aspects of music technology, it can breathe new life into music that we had formerly understood as pure construction. Perhaps now we can hear some of this music, this highly formal music, as eccentric but also mysterious, whimsical but possibly revelatory. So to me, this feels closer to John's interests. In my many conversations with him, the words that come up and again are ambiguity, serendipity. He cultivates a healthy but mischievous irreverence with regard to received wisdom. I think this reflects his interest in Eric Satie and the work that he did for his dissertation at Princeton. Increasingly, I find a sly sense of humor in his music, perhaps a reflection of that surprising meeting ground between high modernism and popular art I mentioned earlier. Today, John's artistic vision goes well beyond music making. I've seen notebooks that are filled with visual designs as well as texts that he generates through computation. In fact, I know of no other composer who thinks as deeply about words as he does. His engagements with the works of Roussel, Breton, Duchamp, and the Oulipo is every bit as important to him as the music that he studies. A composer friend of mine once quipped that composers spend the first 10 years of their careers trying to find their voice and then the rest of their life trying to forget it. And with John, it's gotten to the point where I literally have no idea what his next piece is going to sound like. And what I do know, though, is that it will reflect his boundless curiosity, a truly poetic sensibility, and that it will be beautiful. So please welcome John Supko.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Scott, for that wonderful, generous introduction and contextualizing information about the talk. It was a perfect setup for this talk, I think. I also want to thank Ranji and Christina and Michael and everyone at FHI for the invitation. Okay. Some years ago, when Google had already become not just a website, but a verb, I had the thought that search engines might have something to teach us all, not just artists, about experimental aesthetics. You might have heard of those early 20th century mischief makers in Paris who christened their art with the baby talk word Dada, and called themselves Dadaists. They thrived on scandal. In one particularly raucous evening at the Cabaret Voltaire in the early 1920s, the Romanian poet Tristan Tzara antagonized the audience by composing a poem on the spot. As erstwhile Dadaist Philippe Soupeau recalled in his 1963 memoir, Profil Perdu, Lost Profiles, Tzara was picking words written on scraps of paper thrown into a hat that he withdrew at random. This was too much. People hissed, and the event ended in great disarray. The scandal was the elevation of the non sequitur to the status of art, but it was also the perceived affront to the creative act, which was assumed by the public to be done with great solemnity, in solitude, probably in a dusty garret somewhere. In one fell swoop, Zara had demystified and remystified the ways that artists work, and people didn't know what to do with that experience. Well, I wondered, what if the hat filled with scraps of newsprint was instead the whole universe of information available on the internet? And instead of a reaching hand, what if there was an earnest query about the first topic that came to mind? Anything might come back, and the reasonableness of this premise is part of the context that was unavailable to Tristan Tzar's audience. With a search engine, the user accepts the non sequitur as a possibility. It might even be the beginning of a new creative discovery rather than a disenchanting surprise that abruptly ends further inquiry. That's really what the Dadaists were inviting their audience to do, albeit half-heartedly, to find a new world in the arbitrary and the hastily concocted. Today, we can easily view the hatful of words as a primitive prototype of the internet. Anything might be included and connectable. But the Dadaists and other experimentalists also glimpsed what neuroscience would later help us to understand, that the brain not only receives information, but also makes and even fabricates meaning. The brain has a will to impose coherence, even sometimes on the seemingly incoherent. I wondered what might happen to a society that acquired an awareness through technology of the generative power of randomness. Parenthetically, you may already perceive a problem with the word randomness in relation to a search engine, but let's press on for the moment. Perhaps unwisely, I typed the word pleasure into Google's search field. Don't ask me why I picked that particular word, it just came to me. The first result, and so many years later, it is still among the first image results, was a motorbike marketed to women in India by Hero Honda. I'm glad to hear a few laughs at this. This surprising search result is like a lower impact version of what Arthur Koestler suggests is at the heart of creative ideas, the collision and simultaneous understanding of seemingly unrelated things that he calls bisociation. It's less striking than other examples I'll share because we understand in short order, and perhaps too well, what these ad wizards are trying to say. On first blush, it provokes a chuckle, but then the brain starts separating the layers of this image-text relation almost effortlessly, enlisting concepts from linguistics, semiotics, gender and political theory, cultural anthropology, psychoanalysis, and so forth. And I do mean blush, because this bisociation fairly vibrates with innuendo. But thinking about the name of the motorbike and where pleasure actually resides in this connection also puts me in mind of something that the great scholar of literary modernism, Hugh Kenner, wrote in Colonial Lexicon, an essay about the Oxford American Dictionary. Kenner analyzes the challenges of translating one of Homer's most well-known phrases, epi oinopa ponton, upon the wine-dark sea. That central word, oinopa, or oinops in the nominative, is a combination of two separate Greek nouns, oinos, wine, and ops, face or eye. Kenner writes, in saying with the look of wine, the words point to wine's color, not, for instance, to its sparkle. Therefore, we are to think of a red wine and not a white. And the salient quality of this wine's color is darkness. Kenner tells us that each of these points has been challenged by scholars since Little and Scott devised this famous translation. In our motorbike example, pleasure, like the darkness of wine, is both there and not there. Of course, the heritage of ads like the one for the pleasure goes back to at least the 1960s, when Koestler's ideas started to appear indirectly in corporate marketing strategy. Ad agencies were becoming interested in aesthetic values associated with modernism, especially shock, surprise, contradiction, and what Edward de Bono, a close reader of Koestler, called lateral as opposed to linear thinking. The famous 1960 Lemon Volkswagen ad by the Doyle Dane Bernbach agency took a pejorative word for shoddily made foreign cars and used it as an opportunity to tout the German automaker's high quality assurance standards. This was a car that was rejected. It didn't make it to the US because there was a problem with the fender or something. I linger on advertising not just to illustrate the covert adoption of certain modernist ideas and values in popular culture, but because the question of content, what constitutes worthy material for art, was fiercely debated among modernist artists and theorists. I'll pause here to clarify what I mean when I invoke modernism. For the purposes of this talk, I'm referring to the revolutionary ideas and works of many artists in the period from approximately the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. The timelines for the separate disciplines are slightly different and open to debate, of course, but it's helpful to think about modernism as a collection of shared attitudes and approaches to making art, a rejection of the past and historical conventions, including the use of historical forms, an interest in subjectivity rather than universality, abstraction and fragmentation rather than depiction and continuity, an emphasis on direct, unmannered expression, complexity, contradiction, and sometimes shocking originality. Many of these ideas derive from a desire to adapt concepts from the sciences. Others relate to the speed and noise and violence of life after industrialization. You might think of the debates about content as a question of artists either pointing at the world and all manner of human experiences, or pointing away from those things to pure abstraction. Witness this magisterial pronouncement from Theodor Adorno. Artworks detach themselves from the empirical world and bring forth another world, one opposed to the empirical world, as if this other world, too, were an autonomous entity. I personally take a lowercase Catholic and promiscuous view of content. The creative act for me always begins with curiosity about what might happen to me and or to the listener if I worked with a completely different set of materials or ideas. This is both an aesthetic and a practical position. I've used Man Ray to rebut Adorno here because I think that artists should be able to make art with and about anything. I think of this way of working, with apologies to Rudolf Steiner, as a kind of alchemy of the everyday. In moments of doubt about the wisdom of this position, I return to these golden polyphonic lines from the novelist Roberto Bolaño. "Style is a fraud," said de Kooning, and Villa Matas agrees. To have a voice of one's own is a blessing, whether one is a writer, painter, or ventriloquist, but it can lead, or perhaps in fact inevitably leads, to conformism, flatness, monotony. Every work, Villa Matas tells us, peering out at us from the pages of this book, should be a fresh leap into the void, whether anyone is watching or not. Young composers of my generation and older grew up hearing that we had to develop a voice or a style that was immediately recognizable, but I never totally bought that idea. It seems like giving up too much artistic freedom in advance. If you only use certain harmonies or certain approaches to rhythm, you risk perpetuating arbitrary decisions for longer than they might be useful. The maintenance of a consistent style requires exclusion, but I've always been energized by inclusion, by strange collisions of unexpected musical and sonic materials. 100,000 billion pieces for piano and computer, a collaboration with my friend, the brilliant pianist and composer Conrad Tao, illustrates my approach. The title refers to 100 000 milliards de poèmes, 100,000 billion poems, by Oulipo co-founder Raymond Queneau, in which 10 interchangeable versions of a 14-line sonnet result in a total of 10 to the 14th power possible poems. This piece is actually an interactive, generative computer system that proposes unique electronic musical environments with which Conrad can improvise, which he does astoundingly well. The computer listens to and autonomously modifies what Conrad is doing at the piano, and Conrad can in turn control aspects of the computer's activity. Some of those aspects are available for Conrad's manipulation only when the computer decides to allow it. I think of what the computer proposes to Conrad as being provocatively incomplete, meaning the computer's musical behavior is compelling and unpredictable, but not entirely satisfying on its own. In other words, there are absences of intention, of activity, of lyricism that provoke completion by the live performance. I'm going to play a video of a recent pre-concert recording that Conrad did in Chicago for the Nova Musica Linea series recently, last month. Broad, rich eclecticism is a special privilege of artists living with the internet. And while artistic periods and stylistic chronologies are hopelessly entangled in the vast thicket of online media, posing serious challenges for education, the blurring of old aesthetic debates and obliteration of old rules and references make all things new again. This renewal of the familiar is not itself new, however. I think of Gertrude Stein's desire to wash simple nouns clean of their usual meanings and associations by repeating and recontextualizing them. And Ezra Pound's dictum to make it new was often applied to very old sources in his own work. Crucial to this recontextualizing project is fragmentation. In 100,000 billion pieces, when the computer constructs a melodic or rhythmic idea, it does so by choosing and recombining bits of sound from longer recordings of electronic and acoustic instruments. Field recordings I make when I travel, and various species of digital noise and other sonic detritus. Each new computer idea becomes a mosaic of displaced contexts. The smaller and more suggestive the fragments, the more ambiguous the resultant mosaic. This important observation points to a problem in my earlier thinking about the search engine. What search engines do is largely to offer up chunks of thinking already done by others, not fuse ideas at the atomic level. That's not to say that one can't use search engines to bisociate ideas, but the results will have to be shorn of their contexts in a subsequent step. My friend and Duke colleague Bill Seaman has long been inspired by Kessler's bisociation, notably in his work Recombinant Poetics and the more recent Insight Engine, which develops the concept into an interdisciplinary, quote, multi-perspective approach to knowledge navigation and subsequent knowledge production. Bill was doing this groundbreaking work many years before machine learning tools and large language models became available to the general public. Now that those technologies are here, we can all use them to produce new forms of knowledge by finding and connecting ideas at the granular level. Unlike with the search engine, large language models such as ChatGPT and Claude.ai allow us to be as specific as we like about the results we want and what we want them to do. These results can even include computer code that AI writes for us. Andrej Karpathy, a Slovak-Canadian computer scientist and AI researcher, has said that, quote, English is the hottest new programming language. What he means is that anyone, even someone without coding experience, can learn to do the work of a programmer by precisely constructing LLM prompts and iterating on the code the AI returns. It follows that the more one knows about how LLMs work, the more precisely one can use them in this way. The problem is that few people are using them in this way, that is, as tools that require iterative human intervention. Just as we often find ourselves curiously satisfied by the first 2 or 3 Google search results, seldom wondering if we've actually found the highest quality information, the new AI technologies are so easy to use and seem so superficially intelligent and capable that users can be convinced that the AI has done their thinking for them. This is not good. These AI tools have one job, and that job is not thinking. It is producing text. They are trained on immense quantities of online text, all of Wikipedia, countless news articles, digitized books, websites, and more. Their universe is vast, yet only as deep as the ink on the printed page. This training process on syntax, semantics, and sentiment gives the LLM highly sophisticated, near human-level language production. The reason it might seem that an LLM is thinking is because it is statistically manipulating the products of human thought, which are the texts it has been trained on. The thinking has already been done, it's simply being rearranged. If the training data set is out of date, the LLM will hallucinate anything it has to in order to produce text, names, dates, events, facts, and more. If you challenge its accuracy, it will thank you and politely apologize. For now, the philosopher John Searle's 1980 Chinese room argument remains for me a helpful explanation of how computers fail to think, understand, or have a mind. Searle said they simply exchange one set of symbols for another, according to a collection of rules, just as the non-Sinophone translator can translate Chinese into English by following an instruction manual in Searle's thought experiment. It's true that recent AI technology is doing much more mathematically than simply manipulating symbols, but the representation of data still occurs. I think Searle's argument remains helpful, perhaps even correct for now, because I don't believe consciousness can emerge solely from exposure to text. I'm not a philosopher, neuroscientist, or computer scientist, but my intuition is that artificial consciousness would require more than a purely linguistic training. Adding multimodal sensory input, touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell, seems to offer a better chance of approximating or perhaps one day generating something like human cognition in a machine. I think it's uncontroversial to say that LLMs, when literally left to their own devices, will often produce bland, facile, hollow stuff. The remedy is iterative human intervention. Better quality input ensures better output. And each cycle of iteration molds the output more closely to the mind and intentions of the user. But it also opens a serendipitous feedback loop where misunderstanding, malfunction in all their degrees of severity tend to spark new ideas and dislodge creative blockages. This is especially true when using an LLM to write software programs, where, to paraphrase Brian Eno, error can function as a hidden intention. To demonstrate what I mean about the potential of an iterative approach to working with LLMs, I used Claude.ai to develop a script in the music programming language SuperCollider for today's talk. My idea was to create a software program that takes one of my field recordings as an input, analyzes it for pitch and rhythm characteristics that could be developed musically, reorders and repeats certain parts of the recording to simulate compositional structure, and adds filtering and delay effects, and composes some new piano and percussion music based on the analysis. I stress that the result is nothing like a complete composition, but rather a draft proposed by the computer that I can discard, which I probably will, or continue to develop manually. I can run the script as many times as I want until I find something that seems promising. I can also continue to add and modify the SuperCollider approach, the SuperCollider code if I choose. And for the record, this script is the product of over 300 iterations. So we'll just listen to this little transformation of a field recording made in 2018 in Mexico City.
Tacos, tortas, guaraches, alambres. Pozole, pancita, enchiladas, alambres, querida. Pozole, pancita, enchiladas. Pozole, pancita, enchiladas, alambres, querida. Comer destilado, caballero. Tacos, tortas, guaraches, alambres. Tacos, tortas, guaraches. Comer destilado, caballero. Tacos, tortas, guaraches. Comer destilado, caballero.
If the invention of photography could revolutionize not only the painter's relationship to the canvas, but also guide the public's understanding of experiments in perspective, perhaps the broad accessibility of LLMs will further expand experimental aesthetic literacy, grounded in technological understanding across today's society. I suppose this thinking makes me, against my better judgment, an optimist. But don't worry, I can also do existential despair. In such a mood, I tend to look at history rather than confabulating an unknowable future dystopia. Returning to the lost profiles of poet Philippe Soupeau, we find him writing that at 16, this would have been about 1913, I had the somewhat vague but persistent impression that I was witnessing the end of the world, the decline of a civilization. My high school comrades and I were not expecting what was to come. We were, in truth to tell, like the bourgeois and petit bourgeois milieu in which we lived, very poorly informed. At the end of our adolescence, the war broke out. I think it is very hard now, in the overwhelming light of the Second World War, to understand what the First World War represented to us adolescents. 10 years later, one of my best friends, a very talented designer, took his own life. One cannot live in a world where everyone cheats, he wrote to me to explain his act of despair. He summed up in one sentence the feeling of a greater number of young people than you might have thought. Philippe Suppo died in 1990 at the age of 92, but this passage has more than one parallel with life as we know it in 2025. For the young Suppo, the world and civilization felt like they were ending before the two world wars, before the Holocaust and Soviet-engineered famines, before the nuclear arms race, AIDS, and many other catastrophes we have lived through and continue to live with. Yes, war might be coming again for us too, but I can't help wondering if perhaps every generation feels the world is ending. AI has been cited as an existential threat, and it may well be one. My friend, the critic Jeffrey Edelstein, recently asked me about AI. Is it more dangerous than the atom bomb? I don't know. I do know that one way humans heal from, or at least process catastrophe, is through making art. Out of the wreckage of the social order, artists devised techniques to help us see and hear the world anew. The Dadaists scattered the fragments of the old world into perversely arbitrary configurations, insisting that so-called nonsense had more to offer than the dull certainties of reason. Surrealism's automatic and dream-based experiments trawled the depths of the subconscious, emboldened by Sigmund Freud's research. In his 1932 book, Les Vases Communicants, the writer Entrepretant conceived of the contents of two communicating vessels, the vases communicants, in which substances of the dream and the waking life meet and commingle on the page. The Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein developed his experimental approach to montage, rupturing the visual narrative through seemingly unrelated juxtapositions as a way to galvanize viewers into political action. The modernists' embrace of fragmentation, juxtaposition, contradiction, and indeterminacy had the effect of involving others, whether performers or audience members, in the completion and realization of their works. Umberto Eco systematically examined this approach in his 1962 book, The Open Work. It is obvious, Eco writes, that works like those of Berriot and Stockhausen are open in a far more tangible sense. In primitive terms, we can say that they are quite literally unfinished. The author seems to hand them on to the performer more or less like the components of a construction kit. He seems to be unconcerned about the manner of their eventual deployment. Eco is referring to works such as Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11 that ask the pianist to construct a performance of fragments by choosing almost at random the order in which to play them. Nearly a decade earlier, Roger Shattuck was writing in similar terms about Guillaume Apollinaire's 1913 poem Lundi rue Christine, Monday on Christine Street, which is an unedited transcription of bits of conversation Apollinaire heard while sitting at a cafe in the Rue Christine in Paris. Shattuck's study, The Banquet Years, calls these randomly collected scraps of dialogue raw lumps of thought, offered directly to the readers who must digest them for themselves. The numerous scientific and technological advances of the late 19th and early 20th century and 20th centuries expanded artists' tools, materials, and understanding of aesthetic possibility. In the machinic din of industrialized cities, composers like the Italian Luigi Russolo heard the orchestra of the future. The portable tape recorder allowed French composer Pierre Schaeffer to capture train sounds and compose with them as though they were so many tiles in a mosaic. The effect of recording, wrote Brian Eno, is that it takes music out of the time dimension and puts it in the space dimension. I alluded earlier to photography's influence on Picasso's Cubism. We also know that the locomotion studies of Marais and Muybridge were essential to the creation of the early nudes painted by Marcel Duchamp. Later, the proliferation of advanced technologies, particularly computers, brought machine control systems to the forefront of the popular imagination. In the decades after World War II, scientists began to repurpose technologies developed during the conflict for more constructive aims, such as communications and systems relating to society and the environment. From these efforts emerged the field of cybernetics. In the 1960s, artists began to work with computers and cybernetic concepts. Jascha Reichart organized the legendary cybernetics Serendipity exhibition in London in 1968. Namjoon Paik, Gordon Pask, and Jean Tinguely were among the artists whose interactive systems-based works were featured. In the same decade, Milton Babbitt began writing music for the RCA Mark II synthesizer, which he could program to perform works of immense complexity. Babbitt and his contemporaries were understandably excited at the prospect of composing music without regard to human performance limitations. And in 1969, the great exponent of musical chance procedures, John Cage, was also programming computers in the early Fortran language. Fast forward to today, large language models can be trained on a corpus of music, all of Mozart, say, in the same way that they can be trained on all of Wikipedia or every issue of Mad magazine. I personally don't like this training methodology, as it tends to produce less interesting versions of the training data, warmed over Mozart, third-rate Brahms. You can understand why. It's rearranging the thinking of these composers without their human instinct for the well-placed anomalies we sometimes call strokes of genius. I prefer to use computers to find musical ideas that humans wouldn't ordinarily think up. The computer's lack of taste and inhibitions, coupled with its speed and inexhaustibility, can produce strangely compelling results if one takes the time to find them. When that happens, however, I never accept the computer's results wholesale. I edit and manipulate them as I would any other material. I don't want computers to compose for me, and I'm not so interested in the sophistication of my tools, only in their capacity to surprise and intrigue me. I've always thought that technological sophistication was inversely related to artistic sophistication, that the more of the human's job a machine can do, improvise, compose, etc., the less interesting the results, which is part of the reason the AI tools I design only do so much. They never have full autonomy over the music. Fragmentation gives me access to the computer's strange creativity, but it also allows me to contextualize it in a way that humans still recognize as music, I hope. Inherent to human creativity, it seems to me, are the incomplete ways in which we know things, the accidents of when and where we were born, the books we have or haven't written, specific experiences and memories we each have, all contribute unpredictably and inconsistently to our ways of knowing. And from these imperfect bases of knowledge and different points of focus, fixations, aversions, curiosities arise that form personal aesthetic ideas. These personal ideas, in turn, help one make compelling works of art or scholarship and to interpret those of others. The networked and systematic nature of artificial intelligence means that once it reaches its zenith, every computer will know and do the same things in essentially the same ways. So the development models of AI and humans are inherently misaligned. No human thinks they need to know everything, even in their own field, to be the best sculptor or dancer or writer. I suppose I focus on computational strangeness, anomalies, mistakes, ruptures, because those qualities resonate deeply with my understanding of human creativity. On a practical level, the inaccuracies of AI pose enormous problems made worse by their ability to disguise factual and conceptual errors behind perfect syntax, spelling, and punctuation. Musicians, however, are in a special position to see through this ruse. Computers are still bad at spontaneously generating musical notation without substantial human intervention. So the need for editing is visible at a glance. This Python script I developed with Claude.ai, for instance, produces music that combines jazz harmonies with gestures reminiscent of Boulez and Stockhausen. When opened in a notation program, the unedited results are ugly, excess ledger lines, wrong clefs, unplayable passages, but that's not a problem for me. I treat these raw outputs as an optimistic prospector might pan a river for gold. I generate many results, listen, and extract the most promising bits. But musicians will instantly recognize what is wrong with notation like this, while readers of AI-generated prose often miss the same kinds of problems, failures of expression, coherence, or aptness, because they are camouflaged by superficial grammatical polish. The perception that AI increases speed and productivity only makes things worse, discouraging the slow, attentive engagement that intelligent and creative use of such tools requires. What I'm saying is that the immense capacities of tools like LLMs should in fact slow us down as we consider how best to use their computational power. And I'm a passionate advocate of slowness, slow, close reading, slow thinking, slow writing. In case you haven't detected them already, I have rather contrarian tendencies and preferences. I find them generative for my thinking and composing. The complexity of some modernist works invites us to slow down and involves us personally and individually in the process of meaning making. These works can seduce us if we give them half a chance. Viktor Shklovsky, the great Soviet literary critic, maintains that an artist's job is to prolong aesthetic attention paid to it. Just how does he say we should do this? One way is by making the familiar unfamiliar. He's the originator of the concept of defamiliarization. I like to use Man Ray's sculpture, The Gift, as an easily graspable example. One can never quite get over it. But Shklovsky has more to say about this, how artists make problems for themselves and how these problems convert to artworks that we want to spend our time with. In Energy of Delusion, a book on plot, Shklovsky writes that no one will contradict the fact that genius isn't afraid of getting lost, because talent will not only show the way out, but talent, one may say, demands delusions, for it demands strain, nourishment, material. It demands a labyrinth of linkages into which it has been called to investigate. AI can take us as deeply as we want to go into the labyrinth of linkages, but the price of entry is time. Time spent with technology, intervening, iterating, molding the outputs to the shape of one's own quirky personal creativity, and time spent reading, looking, and listening widely. Because the more one is aware of, the more connections one's brain will suspect, identify, hallucinate, destroy, concoct. Shklovsky points to the challenges of understanding many modernist works. When I play Milton Babbitt's music for students, the first response is always to declare the music chaotic. They are often amazed to learn that every pitch, every rhythm, every dynamic marking, and more has been painstakingly organized according to the principles of total serialism. This dissonance between structure and perception is one of the great stumbling blocks to appreciating modernist music. I find John Cage's advice helpful. He says, if something is boring after 2 minutes, try it for 4. If still boring, then 8, then 16, then 32. Eventually one discovers that it is not boring at all. In all sincerity, I recommend you try listening to a piece by Milton Babbitt many times, perhaps once a day over several weeks. You may find that the initial shock of the unfamiliar recedes, and you begin to experience music in a new way, as sonic energy with its own form of drama and expressive landscape. And it might be helpful to know that Babbitt had a wonderful sense of humor. You need only to peruse some of his titles on the screen to detect the playfulness that served as a fascinating counterbalance to his intellectual rigor. Complexity can also be interpretive and psychological, arising from the act of attending to works whose forms are relatively uncomplicated. A regrettable legacy of modernism is the notion that abstraction is inherently more serious or more sophisticated than non-abstract works. To rebut this simplistic idea, here is the American painter Kerry James Marshall talking about his early work with abstraction and his rationale for returning to figuration during a recent podcast interview. He says, after a period where I did a lot of abstract painting and mixed media collage work and things like that, and coming to the conclusion that working abstractly for me was the least intellectually challenging approach to making art I had ever experienced. It's almost impossible to sustain any long-term interest in that kind of work or to look at or to make. One could imagine modernists like Lucian Freud and Alice Neel saying something similar, and in fact, they did. Neel says, I'm against abstract and non-objective art because such art shows a hatred of human beings. It is an attempt to eliminate people from art, and as such, it is bound to fail. And Freud says, those who use the language of purely abstract forms are depriving themselves of provoking more than an aesthetic emotion. Seems like they've been reacting to Adorno. Incidentally, I also admire Kerry James Marshall's refusal to get embroiled in a facile political discussion in that podcast interview, or to concede a superficial political motive to his art. His work is much richer, much subtler, much more complex than that. I feel strongly that the requirements of effective political speech, clarity, directness, presumptions about the audience, etc., make politics a very bad basis for art. There are certainly exceptions, but I feel that most overtly political works of art fail, both as art and as political speech, for opposite reasons. And while I'm being provocative, I might as well add that I feel the same way about self-expression. Guy Davenport has written wonderfully about this, that self-expression is a pretty lousy impetus for art making. The reason modernism tended to promote abstraction and surface-level complexity is easy enough to understand. It was the most direct way of enacting a rupture with the past. The rhetoric these artists sometimes used about historical convention could be highly dismissive, even violent. Rousselot, the futurist, memorably called the concert halls of 1913 hospitals of anemic sounds. In the 1960s, the composer, conductor, and modernist firebrand Pierre Boulez exclaimed that opera houses should be blown up. Like most extremist positions, though, these are ultimately boring propositions. Inclusion, expansion, reinvention, recontextualization are always more interesting, more complex than the exclusions, disavowals, refusals, and snobbery that make modernism's worst tendency, that marked modernism's worst tendencies. Ezra Pound developed a vision of newness that didn't respect time's arrow or the fashions strewn in its wake. Setting the scene for Pound, the critic Guy Davenport writes, the 19th century had discovered that all behavior with time's monolinear progress was evolutionary. Davenport sees how Pound pulled time out of joint. It was Pound's determination to obliterate such a configuration of time and history, to treat what had become a world of ghosts as a world eternally present. I have found nothing that better expresses my own aspirations regarding musical influence in history. Pound made it new by alluding to, quoting, mimicking, parroting, transfiguring, and disguising the merely old and the very ancient. In architecture, the great modernist Carlo Scarpa offers an instructive example of stylistic fusion across centuries. This is his 1957 Olivetti showroom in the colonnade of Venice's Piazza San Marco. Scarpa doesn't conceal the junctures of his work with the older Venetian architecture, yet he achieves a timeless coherence that transcends style and period. Scarpa's openness to the past makes him something of an anomaly among modernists, but that's why I like him. I admire Samuel Beckett's writing for a similar reason. He has the reputation of being a sort of bleak modernist minimalist, but his work also contains ribald and scatological jokes, strange games of logic spun out to absurd lengths, musical notation, sudden appearances of Robert Burton's 17th century vocabulary, shocking violence, and flashes of profound linguistic beauty, which was the inheritance from Joyce that came so naturally, and of which Beckett was so keen to divest himself. Beckett's idiosyncratic eclecticism leads me to some last examples from my own work, Crossed Shadows, which was written for the wonderful Red Clay saxophone quartet, and which includes pre-recorded electronic instruments and an improvising drummer. In a talk on ambiguity and serendipity, in which I have already stated my aversion to self-expression as a starting point for the creative act, Crossed Shadows gives me a chance to clarify that I do not deny self-expression is at work in my music. I simply like to discover it after the fact. Because the subconscious, if you leave it alone, will give you more than enough self-expression for free, though possibly not the kind you were expecting. On a certain level, Crossed Shadows has something to do with death, or one death in particular. Not that anyone would know this but me. The title's shadows might suggest it, perhaps, but I didn't put the shadows in the piece. They emerged from an Oulipo procedure I applied to a one-sentence story by Amy Hempel long before I wrote the music. The procedure keeps the syntax, but changes the specific words, although the software I wrote to do this makes lots of mistakes. In my program note to Cross Shadows, I write that the computer and I wrote this poem in 2018. It struck me as, well, haunting, but I didn't immediately know what to do with it, so I tucked it away in case a future use might arise. The passage of time has a way of working wonders on interpretive meaning. Rereading it 5 years later, I recognized the face of the shadow, one of them anyway, and felt the impulse to make music with this text. Crossed Shadows alludes to different styles and eras of music, most tied to my associations with the saxophone, that are swirled, blurred, and elided into a kind of frantic totentanz. Not so much a dance of death as a dance about death, with the freneticism serving as a coping mechanism. I think of this as a strategy to distract from or forestall grief. It reminds me of how the mako shark has to keep swimming nonstop or it will suffocate to death. When I write music, I try to hold nothing back, to enfold my pieces with layers of information, linguistic, stylistic, psychoacoustic, computational, environmental, and so forth, but to do so with a light touch, not the lightness of frivolity, as Italo Calvino has written, but a lightness of thoughtfulness which can make frivolity seem dull and heavy. To create cross shadows, I recorded the computer-generated text myself, then made a program to manipulate the speed and frequencies of my voice. I converted both recordings into pitches and rhythms and used those elements as the scaffolding onto which I composed the rest of the music manually. Using speech rhythms as a structural element resulted in very complex, changeable meters. Red Clay, and especially my Duke colleague Susan Fancher, spent a great deal of time helping me to adapt these rhythms for human consumption. Late in the project, I had the idea to ask Jake Richter, an extraordinary jazz drummer and current Duke graduate student, to improvise a drum set part for the piece. Jake recorded the 5 different takes, floating effortlessly over the changing meters. I stitched together a hybrid version from 3 of those takes, and the resulting music seems to coalesce into a series of deceptive grooves. If you tap your foot, sooner or later, the beat will always slip away. Here's an example of what I mean. It's a 1.5 minute excerpt. While Cross Shadows shares little on its surface with the iconic works of modernism, its structure is imbued with gestural and textural complexity, not to mention its computational origins that strongly derive from mid-20th century musical aesthetics. My hope is that the discrepant harmonic language, Cross Shadows is obviously jazz and pop-coded, will result in pleasurable difficulties of perception. Some of these difficulties stem from the many simultaneous layers of information involved, the pitches and rhythms derived from human speech, the live, athletic saxophone quartet constantly at play between cohesion and rupture, the hyperactive, nostalgic electronic instruments, and Jake's improvisational virtuosity on the drums. In the final 2 minutes of the piece, there is a collision of strict repetition and stochastic indifference. The 3 upper members of the quartet loop a single measure more than 30 times. Here's a few of them. While the baritone saxophone plays a solo that is perhaps the most unadulterated computer-generated material of the piece. The synths play a slow chord progression that changes on fractions of the beat, while the other electronic instruments double the saxes. And all of this happens while Jake smashes away on the drums. I'll conclude by playing the full version of this moment, with all the layers sounding together as intended. But before I do, I want to acknowledge that I could not have created this piece without the serendipitous discoveries afforded by computation, nor without the dedicated, painstaking collaboration of Red Clay and Jake Richter. Just as I couldn't have created 100,000 billion pieces without the astonishing musicality of Conrad Tao. Layering human and computational creativity in a work of art used to be an arcane, ad hoc endeavor. I marvel that the exhilarating possibility of reaching beyond the limits of one's own imagination is now open to everyone, and that everyone seems eager to talk about it. Yet, the speed and convenience of these tools can easily mislead. Working with AI's vast capacities for serendipitous discovery should, in fact, slow us down and add nuance to serious work. The value of these complications is evident in the history of modernism, which I think of as an atlas of aesthetic difficulties and pleasures. Conversely, understanding how AI technology works provides us with new frameworks, both for interpreting past experiments and imagining new ones. If we want a world in which the things we read, look at, and listen to still hold and repay our attention, we will have to consider AI as a tool that only works when human beings guide and shape what it offers us. Thank you. Yes.
Curious about your thoughts on purely AI generated, flooding major platforms.
Yeah.
And just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, it reminds me of the early days of electronic music, when the computers that were being used in research were as big as this room, and they had about 5 kilobytes of memory, and the people working on them were understandably mathematicians and scientists who maybe had a rudimentary public school training in music, as many people did in the 50s and 40s and 50s, but they weren't artists. And so the music that they were writing with these machines was very rudimentary. And it's sort of like that, because I think there's this engineering or design focus where, wouldn't it be great if a machine could compose music, and couldn't we make a lot of money doing that? But that is not an artistic perspective. The problem, I mean, engineers love to solve problems, but I think we're talking about different problems. When the computer doesn't work well, or it does things that sort of are unintended, for an artist, that can be very interesting, and it can send you in a different direction. So you have a collision of the marketplace and some kind of artistic production, but it's not really the the most interesting version of that. Sure. Rosine?
I just a little footnote to what you just said. So you mentioned, oh, sorry.
Yeah, you mentioned cybernetics briefly, and I just actually happened to recently be reading a bit of Stafford Beer's work, and the one thing that he said very provocatively, but it reminded me of it, was that machines don't make mistakes. As if to say that, you know, like they're designed in a certain way, and I guess in the case of AI, they're designed mostly to avoid work as opposed to create new things. And that was really interesting because you're sort of interested in when there's anomalies, when there's something unexpected. But of course, that's intricately connected with the way the machine is built. So I don't know. I just wondered if you could.
Yeah, well, I mean, our tools reflect our the human designers, makers of them. So, you know, it kind of reminds me of how my teacher Paul Lansky wrote tonal, beautiful lyrical music in a moving way, as though trying to make this, you know, strange box of gears and electronic guts sing a song or try to sing a song. And that's a kind of moving encounter with the human, or the attempt to be human in technology. And I think that computers will represent the mistaken thinking of their programmers in all sorts of ways. And it's very interesting for humanists to unpack that, especially when technology has to recognize a face. Who is training this technologies? Or who, you know, the range of people that are being used to train the technology is very important, right? So yeah, the mistakes that the computer makes, luckily I'm making things for myself in an artistic setting, and usually no one gets hurt, but we do have to think very carefully about the kinds of mistakes the computers make, and what we do about them. Scott.
Thank you, Don. Really interesting talk. You know, I was just wondering, the idea of making mistakes in a digital computation. I mean, the program will compile or it won't, or throw an error, but often, like you say, you might have some kind of interesting error in the algorithm that turns out to be provocative, and something fruitful about that interaction, the difficulty of that interaction. And I was just thinking then with the resurgence of analog synths, where mistakes, serendipity are really forgiven and welcomed and always fruitful. But I was just wondering if you could say something a little bit about the kind of workflow or dynamics or creativity in that area when you're turning knobs and, you know, connecting wires versus trying to write codes and getting the semicolons in the right place and whatnot as you're designing an algorithm in a digital sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, truthfully, I get very paralyzed by knobs and buttons, the choice there. And part of my my strategy for making software tools is to make those decisions for me, so that I can observe the results of those decisions. So, you know, if there are 100 parameters, I can generate 1,000 settings of those 100 parameters very quickly and just listen and decide. Whereas with the code, I do think that it gives me something of an objective, almost therapeutic experience when I'm working with so much subjectivity and irrationality. You know, computers are expecting information in a certain format, you have to give it to them in a certain way so that they do what you're expecting them to do. And that requires linear thinking. But of course, linear thinking in an artistic context is not very interesting. It's one of the reasons I said that self-expression is a lousy impetus for artistic work, because it's essentially, I'm feeling sad, I'm going to write a sad song. Okay, we know the song is sad. Why are we've grasped it. That's not interesting. But if the sadness comes out in, say, you know, when Graham Greene reviewed Nabokov's Pnin, he said it's a very funny book, but there's a sadness there and you don't know where it comes from. It's these little pockets of sadness that accumulate over time that give that sort of under the surface impression. That's the kind of approach to self-expression that I'm interested in. And I think it gets somehow working with code, it gets filtered through. That linear process of making code results in very unlinear results.
If you have a question, can you please speak into the microphone for the recording and accessibility? Thank you.
Wonderful talk, John. So I'm imagining you sitting there listening to 300 iterations of something that you've asked.
And cursing.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, you know, it must really highlight or the you know, how you make your aesthetic choices to yourself. You have to confront, you know, why am I liking this one more than another one? And and I'm just wondering how, you know, how that process has evolved for you, and how you know, what guidelines do you use for yourself to choose one thing over another?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's that approach has changed over the years, and of course, it's been a source of frustration and doubt for me, especially working in the context of the groves of academe, because we often walk around, we have a tendency to think that the body is a transportation device for the brain, and that the brain is the only thing that matters, and that there's certain, by implication, there's certain musics that are more sophisticated or give more of an intellectual impression than others. And I've sort of jettisoned all of that thinking. And I have a rule, and the rule is don't be boring. I want to be interested, intrigued by the machine. I don't want to understand everything it's doing necessarily. But I think of myself as a first listener. So if I'm interested in something, there's a chance perhaps someone else might be interested in it. So it's not a very sophisticated set of criteria, but that's the way I tend to approach these things.
And it's kind of instinctive and not necessarily rational, but just...
Oh, absolutely. No, it's not rational at all. I mean, I can't give you an argument for why I chose X or Y necessarily. Beyond, I liked it better. It sounded better to me. Yeah. There's more. I could see more future in the piece, in it, more of the piece in what I was hearing.
So Ranulph Glanville, who's a cybernetician and also a contrarian, president of the American Society for Cybernetics, wrote about unmanageability. And he talked about it as an anti-cybernetics, and he talked about it as a way to generate variety, and but also an iterative method, which you start in the unmanageable, and then you understand ways to make it manageable. Do you think that that's part of your strategy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, starting from the etymology of the word cybernetics, kybernetikos, the person who steers a ship. So thinking of a system as a ship on an ocean that's being buffeted by the waves and the air, the wind, but it has a course, right? So it could come off course by external factors, and the design of the system is intended to keep it on course. And what you're talking about there is in a feedback, which is of course another cybernetic concept, in a system where the system observes what it's putting out and it's getting fed back into the system. The interesting thing there is that the unmanageability, this kind of chaotic behavior, starts to become manageable, or starts to have a signal through the noise by features of the system. And I think that's really interesting. It's hard to, in a short answer, it's hard to describe how that might happen, but I think instinctively I'm interested in that I'm confused or sort of provoked in some way by what the computer's giving me. I don't understand it completely, but by working with it, I have a better understanding of what I could do as an artist with the material.
And do you plan to publish this talk or the video?
Thinking about things to do with it, maybe expanding it, but I don't want to jinx it or commit to anything publicly.
But beautiful, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I learned so much. I don't know anything about this topic, so this is like really fascinating. I am wondering about, as a listener who's not an expert in this field at all, what I'm supposed to be listening for. And because of the kind of context of the talk, I was really trying to figure out which part is human, which part is computer. I was trying to dissect it. And there's such difference between the video that you showed of a performer actually performing versus just listening. The performer, I really see the human, right? There's such human control and creativity. And the listening part felt like I was really listening to where is the computer part of this. So what do you want the listener to find? What should be the kind of the attitude or the framework that the listener should be in to really appreciate what you're creating?
Yeah, I mean, without being glib, I don't intend to be glib, but I think the best answer is whatever the listener finds, and that would be different for each person. So, I was watching a talk given by a recording engineer not too long ago, and he said something really interesting, which is that, and this is a problem that recording engineers have a lot in their work. They'll get to a point in their mix where they think everything is set and they like it, it's ready to print, and then they wake up the next morning and listen to it and it sounds like crap and they don't know why, or there's something there that is a glaring error they missed and they can't understand how did they miss this. It's like hitting them in the face. So the answer is because there's so much information. And even, in a Mozart string quartet recording or performance or, a piece of plain chant or certainly Ornette Coleman performance, whatever we're attending to, there's just so much data there, if you want to think of it that way, that every encounter is only able to process a subset of the data. And that's part of the reason we re-listen to recordings, our favorite recordings, our favorite songs, our favorite performances and artists, because we hear something different. Literally, we hear something different. So I think that's one of the reasons I was suggesting that people get over the initial shock of strangeness when listening to Milton Babbitt and listen to it repeatedly, because you'll start to learn his tone of voice, his manner of saying things, and not even listening to it analytically or catching all of the serialist organization principles behind it. Just listening to it as pure energetics, I think, can be a very worthwhile thing. There's nothing to catch unless you catch something.
Thank you so much, John. I thought that was a really wonderful talk, and I'm not even sure what my question is, but I'm just going to start with various points of appreciation, and I think there's a question there. I'm teaching this course on early Frederick Jameson at the moment, and I was struck by the various references that I have refamiliarized myself with this semester, teaching this course. And one of the things that strikes me, and luckily I think I sort of share this aesthetic, is that some people are modernist subjects, and I'm not sure how many are now produced. And what I mean by that is that if I was thinking about your timelines here, and Jameson has this sense that that if you're thinking about a move in literature from realism to modernism, and then later to postmodernism, if you even compare, two countries as close to each other as France and Britain, you're going to have a very different timeline. Modernism, that realism is basically over in 1857 in France, and in Britain it's more like edging towards the First World War, right? And it's to do with a different kind of idea of the social. Right, that is emerging and a subject in relation to that. And also, therefore, as you were sort of saying, I think this idea of a style also that emerges for the modernist figure that can't really be addressed by stylistics, but it is that slow attention to the work of someone, so you begin to understand their language, as it were. And he similarly has this idea of, listening and difficult, even when his very early work, but then also as he moves on, he has this idea of the long sentence, right? And why you need the long sentence. Why Sartre, he wrote his dissertation on, needed complex, too many colons, that most of us wouldn't need that many colons. And how can you even begin to think about that? And it's really, in some ways, these are the people who are interested in time. They're interested in temporality. And then when you sort of, you think about the moments that, in so many ways, what you're giving us here is a way of understanding AI as something that we should think of in relation to a form of fragmentation that might be closer to modernist collage than postmodernist pastiche, right? But how is it that you invite? I mean, I hear what you're saying. Listen for 4 minutes, then listen for 8 minutes, then for the 16 minutes. We can do that as we teach. We can say, take it slowly, slow it down, right? But is it kind of a losing battle? Because is the world now populated by people who are literally, the shape of their bodies is changing again with the prosthetic of the phone or something. And I don't necessarily mean this in a judgmental way. I do a little bit because, as I said, I'm a modernist as well. So sorry, I'm going on too long, but I'm trying to sort of think about the invitation into the aesthetic is very beautiful. I loved your talk, and thank you so much for it. And I'm just trying to think about how to invite a public into the slowness.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. I think I have so many things to say. First, about the question of periods. I resisted putting a slide up there for a long time because any dates you put down, I wanted to put as little information as possible because I think of an exception. And of course, someone like Leonora Carrington and Dorothea Tanning, they died within a year of each other in 2011, 2012. So did serialism, extend to the 21st century? No, I don't think so. But in terms of this question of how we invite the public into a kind of slower relationship with these works, to answer that, I think I would turn back to what I was saying about when I quoted Profil perdu of Supko, because he was feeling the exact same thing. He loved Rimbaud at that time and his high school friends, and he felt that the current literary landscape, this is in the 19-teens, before the war, was sort of mannered and artificial and conventional and boring, and he thought that civilization couldn't continue if people continue making work like this. So I bring that up because I think we certainly did continue, and all of these really wonderful works of art from the 20th century occurred after that feeling that the world and civilization were ending for Supko. So the signs of hope these days, I think one of them might be this. I don't know if anyone has seen news stories about this, but there are high school students who are rejecting the smartphone. There are apps that are trying to get people, ironically, off the smartphone. And I think I do have hope. I'm probably very naive in saying this, but I do have hope that once confronted by an onslaught of empty, soulless AI media production, I think we'll turn against it in a sort of more formalized fashion. I think that it'll become uncool for the youth to sort of perpetuate these kinds of things. So that's my answer to you. I think it'll happen because I I'm really, against my better judgment, I'm an optimist. Okay, thank you very much.